For 40 days on God, Family, and Guns, we'll be focused on God. We have a series on spiritual warfare, the end of times, the prophecy of Daniel, and the prophecy of Malachi. If you want to see our gun-related or Second Amendment-related content, you can see that on Patreon or the History of Weapons. Those links are below. The prophecy of Daniel is our insight into God's plan for the past, present, and future, to see how He works, to see His patterns of things He's done in the past, and also see exactly what He plans on doing in the future. And as we've studied the prophecy of Daniel, we've spent the last few episodes just really talking about why are they in the situation that they are in, and that, oftentimes when you read the book of Daniel, you have to cross-reference it with other books in the Bible. Here at God, Family, and Guns, we don't use any commentary. We only use the Bible as commentary and cross-references. But as we see, oftentimes when people read the book of Daniel, they kind of see that they've been besieged by the Babylonians and that they got taken away. But there was so much more to this. There were literally decades of besiegement and kind of playing a political role back and forth between the king of Babylon and the kings of Judah, and it started with Jehoiakim, and then it went on to other kings before they finally came crashing down. And what we're seeing is we're kind of getting our first introduction to Daniel here in the book of Daniel, and it's important that we take some time to understand why is it that God is blessing Daniel so much, because Jeremiah had a lot to say about it. So we're just going to pick it up starting in chapter 1, verse 3. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men, in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understanding, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them daily provisions of the king's delicacies, and of wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among them, those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now I'm going to pause there real quick, because this situation that Daniel is in is about to be extremely blessed. It feels bad, but when you kind of look at it like a story, it seems really bad. But Jeremiah spoke about Daniel and the people that were with him, not by name, but he spoke about what God's plan was for them specifically. And if we go back to Jeremiah 21, starting in verse 8, it says, "Now you shall say to this people, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. He who remains in this city shall die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. But he who goes out and defects to the Chaldeans who besiege you, he shall live, and his life shall be as a prize to him. For I have set my face against this city for adversity, and not for good, says the Lord. It shall be given into the hand of the king of Babylon, and he shall burn it with fire." So ultimately what's taking place in this moment of Jeremiah is the city is being besieged. Jeremiah and Daniel might have known each other. For sure Daniel knew of Jeremiah. Daniel being a young, studious, probably wealthy, based on the description we got of Daniel of the choice men and women that they were wanting to bring to the palace for training. But Jeremiah would have been preaching to Jehoiakim, and then his son, and then Zedekiah, because there were several kings put in place by the king of Babylon before it was ultimately thrown over. But then there's a very interesting moment where God gives Jeremiah a vision of 2 baskets of figs, and Daniel is in these baskets of figs. So let's just take a look at that in Jeremiah 24, starting verse 1. "Then the Lord showed me, and there were 2 baskets of figs set before the temple of the Lord, after Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away captive Jeconiah the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and the princes of Judah, with the craftsmen and smiths from Jerusalem, and he had brought them to Babylon. So that would have been the choice men and women. Those were the choice people that he brought off. Daniel would have been of those people. Let's go on in 2. One basket had very good figs, like the figs that are first ripe, and the other basket had very bad figs, which could not be eaten. They were so bad. Then the Lord said to me, "What do you see, Jeremiah?" And I said, "Figs. The good figs very good, and the bad figs very bad, which cannot be eaten. They are so bad." Again the word of the Lord came to me, saying, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, like these good figs, so will I acknowledge those who are carried away captive from Judah, whom I have sent out of this place for their own good into the land of the Chaldeans. For I will set my eyes on them for good. I will bring them back to this land. I will build them and not pull them down, and I will plant them and not pluck them up. Then I will give them a heart to know me, that I am the Lord, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. For they shall return to me with their whole heart." In other words, what God's saying is those people that have been let off, Daniel and his friends and all those other people that have been let off, God is going to bless those. His eyes are going to be on them. He's going to prosper them. He's going to keep watch over them, and their hearts are going to turn to him. So being let off in captivity is really the best thing that could possibly happen to any Israelite during this time. It's a great example of how God uses the bad for the things of good. This is the consequence of the wicked ways of the Israelites and Judah and Jerusalem specifically. And those being let off, even though it's 70 years of exile and 70 years of captivity and enslavement, it is very good for them. It's going to feed them. It's going to prosper them. And you're going to see in Daniel's life God's hand on him. And that's why it's so important that we read these first passages as we're introduced to Daniel. Because some of the very next verses we're going to read today talk about how God is blessing Daniel specifically. Because he is of the basket of good figs, being led off to learn the ways of the Chaldeans in Babylon. Now let's take a look, before we go back to Daniel, let's take a look at what are these bad figs. We'll pick it up in verse 8. "And as the bad figs, which cannot be eaten, they are so bad. Surely thus says the Lord, so I will give up Zedekiah, the king of Judah, his princes, the residue of Jerusalem who remain in the land, and those who dwell in the land of Egypt. I will deliver them to trouble into all the kingdoms of the earth, for their harm to be a reproach and a byword, a taunt and a curse in all places where I shall drive them. And I will send the sword, the famine, and the pestilence among them, till they are consumed from the land that I gave to them and their fathers." Now, a quick reminder from the other episode, Zedekiah is the third king after Jehoiakim, so they're still being besieged. That's important. Oftentimes we see movies made about Daniel. It's just Babylonian king comes in, takes everybody away. That's not how it went down. It went on for decades and decades and decades, transferring kings many times before it was finally turned to rubble. And what God is saying here is that he's resting the land for 70 years. Reminder from episode 2, he's trying to rest the land. Well, he's going to rest the land because he told the Israelites to rest it on the 7th year, and they never did. So he's going to rest it for them. He's going to rest that land for them because they were unable to do so themselves. So, anybody left in there, they're going down hard. But who he's blessing now, God's people, have been led off to Babylon, and his eyes are on them, and his eyes are on Daniel, and his heart is with them, and their heart is going to turn right back to God. So now, if we go back to Daniel and just know that where God's heart is towards these people, we'll pick it up again in 6. "Now from among them, those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. To Daniel he gave the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portions of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs." Now, we're going to stop there in the storyline because next episodes we're going to talk about these names. These names have very, very big significances in the plan that God has for the coming of his kingdom. But we're going to pause here because I just want to make note that as Daniel purposed his heart towards God, God brought him into good favor with the chief of the eunuchs. So this is how this is playing out. Immediately, what we see now, there was no mention of God turning his hearts towards those led away and captive in Daniel. So we had to go back to Jeremiah to understand why this is happening. Why Daniel's going to be an incredibly blessed man throughout this time, being led away into captivity by the Babylonians, and eventually he's going to be a blessed man when the Persians conquer the Babylonians. At no point is he not blessed in this storyline, as well as his friends, as well as all of the Israelites that have gone away captive into Babylon. It is God that has put his heart, he has fixed it on Daniel and those that are with Daniel as they've been led away, and those are now his people, and we can see it already, the favor that God is putting into Daniel. And those people that are still in Jerusalem in this moment, they're probably fleeing for their lives from bandits, warriors, rats, pestilence, death, fire, brimstone, the whole thing. It's not going good. So Daniel is in a very, very good position, but as we're going to find out the next episode, we're going to learn about these names. We're going to focus in on these names because they definitely have an importance in the coming of. Names are important. That's why they're in this book. But then we're going to see him purposing himself kind of to not defile himself by these delicacies in wine. We're going to talk about that too. But right now we just got to focus on, God is turning himself on Daniel, and he's focusing on him and those people with him. And it's really kind of beautiful how blessed Daniel is going to be as we read this story. So it's just important as we continue and we're first introduced to Daniel that we understand God is specifically putting his heart towards Daniel specifically. And it's very important that we see it as we continue to follow this beautiful prophecy of Daniel. So hope these videos are helping. Love to hear your thoughts on it. Put it in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support this channel through Patreon, that link is also below. The most important part of this channel, we take prayer requests, so never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love guns.